Hi, I'm Alex. 3 days ago, I was sleeping on a deflated air mattress in my family's freezing garage while my relatives enjoyed Thanksgiving dinner without me. My mother told me it was because we were short on space, that Jessica's new friend needed my room, and I should be grateful they didn't make me find a hotel. I thought being treated like an unwanted guest in my childhood home was rock bottom. I was catastrophically wrong. Because when that friend, a Russian billionaire named Dmitri Volkov, walked into the garage looking for someone, he asked me a question that shattered 26 years of lies. "Where is the energy minister staying?" he asked, scanning the cramped space with confusion. I have been looking everywhere for him. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I stared at him, shivering in my pajamas, wondering if he'd lost his mind. "There's no energy minister here," I told him. "I'm Alex Mitchell. I sleep in the garage." His face went white. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through messages, then looked back at me with something I'd never seen directed at me before. "Respect. You are Alexander Mitchell, yes? The one who wrote the renewable energy infrastructure proposal that saved 3 European countries from blackouts last winter." I nodded slowly, confused why this mattered. Dimitri's expression darkened as he glanced toward the house. "Your family, they do not know who you are, do they?" The morning of Thanksgiving started like every other holiday in the Mitchell household, with me being reminded exactly where I ranked in the family hierarchy. I'd driven 6 hours from my apartment in Albany to spend the weekend in Binghamton, carrying homemade cranberry sauce and a bottle of wine I couldn't really afford, hoping maybe this year would feel different. The leaves were turning brilliant orange and gold along Route 17, and I'd actually felt optimistic for once. I should have known better. The first sign was Jessica's BMW parked in my usual spot, not the driveway, not the street, but the exact spot next to the front steps where I'd parked every time I came home for 15 years. When I knocked on the front door, Mom opened it with that strained smile she reserved for inconvenient situations. "Oh, Alex, you're here," she said, not moving to let me in. "We have a slight situation with the sleeping arrangements." I stood there holding my contributions to dinner, the November wind cutting through my jacket. "What kind of situation?" "Jessica's friend from New York is staying with us," she explained, wringing her hands. "He's a very important business associate, and we've given him your old room." I felt something sink in my chest. "Where am I supposed to sleep?" "The garage is all set up for you," she said quickly. "Your father put a space heater out there, and there's an air mattress. It'll be like camping." I wanted to argue, to point out that I'd called 2 weeks ago to confirm I was coming, that this was my childhood home, that maybe the important business friend could take the couch. But I'd learned long ago that protesting only made things worse. I forced a smile and nodded. "Sure, Mom, no problem." The relief on her face was immediate and genuine, like I'd just solved a complex mathematical equation instead of agreeing to sleep in a garage in upstate New York in November. Dad appeared behind her, already dressed in his good clothes for dinner. "Alex, good to see you," he said, taking the wine from my hands. "This'll go great with the turkey. Did Mom tell you about the sleeping arrangements?" "Very temporary, just for the weekend." He clapped me on the shoulder with the kind of hearty enthusiasm that felt rehearsed. "You understand how it is with these international business types. They have certain expectations." I didn't understand actually, but I nodded anyway. The garage smelled like motor oil and old cardboard, exactly how I remembered from the summers I'd been banished there as punishment. Dad had indeed set up a space heater, an ancient contraption that looked like it belonged in a museum, and an air mattress that had clearly seen better days. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows across the concrete walls lined with storage boxes and forgotten Christmas decorations. "This is fine," I told myself, dropping my duffel bag next to the deflated mattress. I'd plug in the air pump and make the best of it. At least I was here, at least I was included. The pump wheezed and strained for 20 minutes before giving up completely, leaving me with what amounted to a vinyl pancake on the cold concrete floor. I found some old sleeping bags in one of the storage boxes and arranged them into something resembling a bed, trying not to think about how pathetic this was. Through the thin walls, I could hear voices in the house. Jessica's laugh, bright and musical, followed by a deeper voice with an accent I couldn't place. Kevin's booming voice joined in, then Mom's delighted giggle. They were having cocktails, I realized, the pre-dinner socializing that had always been my favorite part of holidays. The warm kitchen filled with the smell of turkey and stuffing, glasses clinking, stories being shared, and here I was, arranging sleeping bags on a garage floor like some kind of vagrant. I tried to shake off the self-pity. This was temporary, just one weekend. I had a good job, a decent apartment, a life outside this house. I didn't need their approval, or their guest room. But as I sat on the makeshift bed, listening to the muffled sounds of my family enjoying themselves without me, I felt 14 years old again, forgotten, inconvenient, always on the outside looking in. The space heater cycled on with a mechanical groan, pushing warm air across my feet for exactly 90 seconds before shutting off again. I pulled my jacket tighter and checked my phone. 3:30 in the afternoon, dinner supposedly at 5, maybe I could help in the kitchen, make myself useful, earn my way back into the warmth. I knocked on the door connecting the garage to the house, the same door I'd used countless times as a kid. Mom opened it barely wide enough to see me, her body blocking the view into the kitchen. "What do you need, sweetie? Can I help with anything?" I asked, trying to peer past her. I could see Jessica at the kitchen island, animated and glowing, gesturing with a wine glass, while she talked to someone out of my line of sight. "We're all set," Mom said quickly, "everything's under control, why don't you just relax out there, we'll call you when it's time to eat." The door closed with a soft click, followed by the distinct sound of the lock turning. They'd locked me out. Not maliciously, I told myself, just practically. They were busy, focused on impressing the important guest, and I was a distraction they didn't need to manage right now. But the lock felt like a physical weight in my chest, a barrier that went deeper than wood and metal. I spent the next hour and a half, sitting in the garage scrolling through social media posts of other families gathering for Thanksgiving. College friends sharing photos of crowded tables and silly traditions, co-workers posting pictures of elaborate spreads and multi-generational celebrations. Everyone looked warm, included, wanted. I closed the apps and tried to read, but the words blurred together as my fingers grew numb, despite the intermittent space heater. At 5:15, Kevin opened the garage door. "Dinner's ready," he announced, then paused, taking in my makeshift sleeping arrangement. "This is pretty rough, Alex." He actually looked sorry, which was more kindness than I'd expected. "I know, but it's just for the weekend," I said, standing and brushing dust off my pants.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
He nodded and held the door open for me, and for a moment I felt like maybe this would be okay after all. The dining room was transformed, gleaming with Mom's good china and crystal glasses, candles flickering warmly across the polished table. The turkey sat golden and perfect at the center, surrounded by all the traditional sides that made my mouth water despite everything. Jessica sat at Dad's right hand, radiant in a designer sweater I'd never seen before, and next to her was the mysterious guest. Dmitri Volkov was not what I'd expected from Jessica's description of a business associate. He was probably 50, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from enormous wealth. His watch alone probably cost more than I made in 6 months. But what struck me most was how comfortable he looked at our modest table, like he genuinely belonged among Mom's mismatched serving dishes and Kevin's football jersey. "Alex, come meet Dmitri," Jessica said, her voice bright with pride. "Dmitri, this is my brother Alex. He works in energy policy up in Albany." Dmitri stood to shake my hand, his grip firm and warm. "A pleasure to meet you, Alexander." Jessica has told me you work in renewable energy, very important field. There was something in his tone, a weight to his words that seemed disproportionate to polite dinner conversation. We sat down to eat, and I found myself in the chair farthest from the turkey, next to Kevin's elbow, and across from an empty spot where someone had clearly been sitting before I arrived. The conversation flowed around me, touching on Dmitri's business interests, Jessica's new job at a consulting firm in Manhattan, Kevin's latest construction project. I contributed where I could, but mostly I listened, grateful to be warm and fed and included, even marginally. Dmitri asked thoughtful questions about everyone's work, displaying a genuine interest that surprised me. When he turned his attention to me, asking about my role at the New York State Energy Planning Board, I felt a flush of pride. Finally, someone wanted to hear about my work, my projects, the infrastructure assessments I'd been developing for the past 3 years. We talked about grid modernization and renewable integration challenges, and for the first time all day I felt like I belonged at this table. But as dinner wound down, as Mom served her famous apple pie and the conversation grew more personal, I noticed something strange. Every time Dmitri looked at me, there was a puzzled expression in his eyes, like he was trying to solve a problem he couldn't quite articulate. He'd glance around the table, then back at me, then at Jessica, as if the pieces of some puzzle weren't fitting together the way he expected. After dessert, as everyone migrated to the living room for football and leftover wine, I excused myself to the bathroom. When I came back, Dmitri was standing in the hallway, studying the collection of family photos that lined the walls. He paused at each one, frowning slightly, and when he saw me approaching, he gestured to a picture from my high school graduation. "This is you, yes?" he asked, pointing to my 18-year-old self in cap and gown, standing slightly apart from my family. I nodded. "You were valedictorian," he observed, reading the small plaque beneath the photo. "Very impressive academics." I shrugged, embarrassed by the attention. It was a small school, not that competitive, but Dmitri didn't seem to hear me. He was staring at the photo with an intensity that made me uncomfortable, like he was memorizing every detail. The rest of the evening passed quietly. We watched football, made small talk, and around 10 o'clock, people started heading to bed. Jessica showed Dmitri to my old room, chattering about thread counts and bathroom logistics, while I gathered my things for another night in the garage. The space heater had given up entirely by the time I settled onto the deflated air mattress, leaving me shivering under 3 sleeping bags, and wondering why I'd bothered coming home at all. I must have dozed off, because I was jolted awake by the sound of the garage door opening. The overhead light flickered on, harsh and sudden, and I squinted against the glare to see Dmitri standing in the doorway. He was fully dressed despite the late hour, and he looked agitated in a way that seemed entirely at odds with his earlier composure. "Excuse me," he said, scanning the cramped space with obvious confusion. "I am looking for someone." "The energy minister, Alexander Mitchell. I was told he would be staying here this weekend." I sat up slowly, clutching a sleeping bag around my shoulders, wondering if this was some kind of fever dream brought on by sleeping in a freezing garage. "I'm Alex Mitchell," I said carefully. "I'm the one who works in energy policy, but I'm not a minister of anything, just a policy analyst." Dmitri stared at me for a long moment, then pulled out his phone and scrolled through what looked like a lengthy message thread. His frown deepened with each screen, and when he looked back at me, his expression had changed completely. "You wrote the renewable energy infrastructure proposal that prevented the European grid failures last winter, yes?" he asked, his accent thickening with emotion. "The one that saved Germany, Poland and Czech Republic from complete blackouts." I nodded slowly, confused about how he could possibly know about that report. It had been classified, shared only with select NATO energy officials, and a handful of international consultants, and you developed the emergency protocols that helped Ukraine maintain power grid stability during the conflict. He pressed on, the mathematical models that allowed for rapid rerouting of electricity from renewable sources. Again, I nodded, feeling increasingly surreal about having this conversation in a garage at midnight while wearing 3 sleeping bags. Dmitri's phone buzzed with an incoming message. He glanced at it, then back at me, and his face went completely white. "You are Alexander Mitchell, the energy security consultant, who has been advising the U.S. State Department on European infrastructure resilience," he said, more statement than question. "The person who European energy ministers credit with preventing a humanitarian crisis last winter." "Yes?" I whispered, still not understanding why this mattered, or how he knew these details. Dmitri was quiet for a very long time, his gaze moving from me to the garage around us, taking in the concrete floors, the broken space heater, the makeshift bed that wouldn't be suitable for a camping trip, let alone housing someone of apparent international importance. When he spoke again, his voice was very soft, very careful. "Your family," he said, "they do not know who you are, do they?" And in that moment, sitting on a deflated air mattress in a freezing garage, I realized that I was about to learn something that would change everything I thought I knew about my life, my family, and myself. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, filled with questions I didn't know how to ask, and implications I couldn't begin to process. Dmitri stood very still in the doorway, his expensive clothes and serious expression incongruous with the cluttered garage setting, while I tried to make sense of what was happening. Finally he stepped fully into the garage, and closed the door behind him, as if ensuring our conversation wouldn't be overheard. "Alexander," he said, settling carefully on an overturned crate, "may I ask you something personal? Why are you sleeping here instead of in the house?" The question seemed simple enough, but something in his tone suggested the answer would be anything but. I explained about Jessica's friend needing the room, about the space constraints and the temporary arrangement, trying to make it sound reasonable, even as the words felt hollow in my mouth. Dmitri listened without interruption, his expression growing more troubled with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for so long I wondered if he'd forgotten I was there. "Alexander," he said finally, "I need to tell you something that may be difficult to hear. 3 months ago, I was approached by representatives of the European Energy Council. They were seeking to hire the most respected energy security consultant in the field, for a project that could determine the stability of power grids across 15 countries. The compensation they offered was extraordinary, 7 figures for 6 months of work, because the expertise they required was so rare and valuable." I shifted uncomfortably on the air mattress, not sure where this was going but sensing it was important. "They gave me a detailed dossier on the consultant they wanted to hire," he continued. "Alexander Mitchell, energy policy analyst, turned international security expert, the architect of the infrastructure resilience protocols that prevented catastrophic blackouts across Eastern Europe. The man who had quietly become one of the most influential voices in international energy security, sought after by governments and corporations alike." My mouth felt dry. "That's me," I said quietly. "I mean, I did write those reports, but I never thought of myself as influential. I just do my job." Dmitri smiled sadly. "That is precisely what made their dossier so compelling. You have developed solutions that have saved millions of people from losing power during critical situations, yet you maintain complete humility about your contributions. Your work has literally prevented humanitarian crises. Alexander, governments pay millions for the kind of expertise you possess." He paused, studying my face in the harsh garage lighting. "So when Jessica contacted me about doing business with her family, mentioning that her brother Alexander worked in energy policy, I assumed I would be meeting the Alexander Mitchell, whose reputation precedes him in international energy circles. I came here expecting to discuss potential consulting opportunities, to perhaps offer you the position the Europeans are so eager to fill." The implications were starting to hit me, making my head spin. "You came here to meet me professionally?" I asked. "About a job?" Dmitri nodded gravely. "A job that would make you financially independent for life, that would establish you as one of the premier energy consultants globally." I brought contracts, proposals, letters of recommendation from energy ministers in 6 countries. I have been carrying them in my briefcase, waiting for the appropriate moment to present them to you. I stared at him, trying to process what he was telling me. Jessica knew. She knew you were coming here to meet me about work. He shook his head slowly. I told Jessica I was interested in meeting her brother who worked in energy, that it might lead to business opportunities for both of us, but I assumed she understood the significance. I assumed your family knew about your reputation, your accomplishments, your value to the international community. The garage felt even colder suddenly, and not because of the broken heater. You mean they have no idea, I said, more to myself than to him. Dmitri's expression was gentle but firm. Alexander, I have spent 3 days in this house, and not once has anyone mentioned your professional achievements, not once has anyone spoken of you with the respect that someone of your stature deserves. Instead, I have watched your family treat you as an afterthought, an inconvenience to be managed and hidden away. He gestured around the garage, his voice growing stronger. The Alexander Mitchell I came to meet, the energy consultant, whose work has influenced international policy, whose mathematical models have prevented blackouts across continents, that man should be staying in the finest hotels, consulting with heads of state, commanding fees that most people cannot imagine. Yet here you are, sleeping on the floor of a garage because your family needed to make room for a guest. The weight of his words settled over me like a physical force. I thought about all the times my family had dismissed my work as boring government bureaucracy, all the conversations where they'd changed the subject when I mentioned my projects, all the years of feeling like my career was somehow less important or impressive than Jessica's marketing job or Kevin's construction work. Dmitri reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, thick and official-looking. Alexander, he said, handing it to me, this is a formal offer from the European Energy Council. The position comes with a base salary of $2 million annually, plus consulting fees that could double that amount. The contract includes housing allowances, travel expenses, and benefits that would ensure you never have to worry about financial security again. I took the envelope with trembling hands, afraid to open it, afraid to believe what he was telling me. Why me? I whispered. Why is my work so valuable? Dmitri smiled for the first time since entering the garage. Because you have a gift for seeing patterns that others miss, for developing solutions that are both innovative and practical. Your European grid analysis didn't just prevent blackouts, Alexander, it revolutionized how international energy systems communicate during crises. Your work has been studied and implemented by every major power grid in the developed world. He leaned forward, his voice earnest and compelling. The consulting world is small, and your reputation is enormous. When energy ministers need someone who can prevent catastrophic failures, they call Alexander Mitchell. When international corporations need infrastructure assessments that could save them billions, they want Alexander Mitchell. You have become, without perhaps realizing it, one of the most sought-after experts in your field. I sat there in the freezing garage, holding a job offer that would change my life completely, while my family slept comfortably in the house, oblivious to the fact that they'd been treating international royalty like an unwanted burden. The irony was so profound it almost felt fictional, but there was something else in Dmitri's expression, something darker that I hadn't noticed before. Alexander, he said carefully, there is one more thing I must tell you. Something that may be even more difficult to process than what I have already shared, and I had the sinking feeling that my night of revelations was far from over. Parts 2. 5. The unfolding truth. Dmitri pulled out his phone again, scrolling through what appeared to be months of correspondence. His face grew increasingly grim as he read, occasionally glancing up at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. The silence in the garage stretched on, broken only by the occasional sound of the house settling above us and the distant hum of traffic on Route 17. When I received Jessica's initial contact 3 months ago, he began slowly. She presented herself as a strategic consultant working with high-net-worth individuals on investment opportunities. She mentioned having access to exclusive deals through family connections, particularly someone with deep expertise in energy infrastructure who could provide invaluable insights for my portfolio companies. Dmitri's accent grew thicker as he became more agitated. She was very convincing, very professional. She sent me detailed market analyses, projected returns on renewable energy investments, insider knowledge about upcoming policy changes that could affect energy stocks. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air seeping through the garage walls. Jessica had been discussing my work with a Russian billionaire for months, presenting herself as some kind of intermediary for my expertise, but I'd never spoken to her about any confidential policy information, had never authorized her to represent me in any capacity whatsoever. She told me her brother was modest about his accomplishments. Dmitri continued, that you preferred to work behind the scenes, rather than seek publicity for your contributions to international energy security. She said this was why you weren't widely known outside of government circles, despite your enormous influence. It seemed reasonable, even admirable. Many of the most brilliant consultants I know prefer anonymity to fame. My stomach was starting to twist as I began to understand the implications of what he was telling me. Jessica had been selling my professional reputation to secure business relationships, using my credentials and accomplishments as leverage in deals I knew nothing about. She'd essentially been running a consulting business based on my work without my knowledge or consent. Over the past 3 months, she has provided me with remarkably detailed information about European energy policies, upcoming infrastructure projects, potential points of failure in international power grids. Information that has proven to be extraordinarily accurate and valuable for my investment decisions. Dmitri's voice carried a note of admiration that made my blood run cold. She has helped me avoid several costly mistakes and identify opportunities that have already generated millions in returns for my various holdings. I stared at him, my mouth dry. Where did she get this information? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew the answer. From you, presumably, he replied. She claimed to have regular consultations with you about international energy trends, that you shared insights from your work with various government agencies and NATO allies. She said you were building a consulting practice, but preferred to work through intermediaries to maintain your security clearance and government positions. The full scope of Jessica's deception was starting to come into focus, and it was staggering. She'd been intercepting my work communications, stealing information from my reports and briefings, and repackaging my professional insights as her own consulting services. But how had she gained access to classified information in the first place? And more importantly, how long had this been going on? Dmitri must have seen the confusion and growing horror on my face, because his expression softened slightly. Alexander, I am beginning to understand that you were not aware of these arrangements. The past few days have been very enlightening, watching how your family interacts with you. It has become clear that something is very wrong with the picture Jessica painted for me. I thought back over the past year, trying to remember conversations with Jessica, times when she'd shown unusual interest in my work or asked specific questions about my projects. There had been several occasions when she'd called unexpectedly, claiming she was proud of my career and wanted to understand what I was working on. I'd been so grateful for her apparent interest that I'd shared more than I should have, discussing general trends and policy directions without mentioning specific classified details. But Jessica was clever, and she'd always been good at getting people to reveal more than they intended. She knew how to ask follow-up questions that seemed innocent, but were designed to extract maximum information. She understood how to make people feel valued and important, while they unknowingly provided her with exactly what she needed for her own purposes. How much has she made from this? I asked, dreading the answer. Dmitri consulted his phone again, pulling up what appeared to be financial records. Based on the consulting fees she has charged me, and what I know of her other clients, I would estimate she has generated somewhere between $2 and $3 million over the past year. My legs felt weak. Jessica had built a multi-million-dollar consulting business by stealing my professional work and selling it to wealthy investors, all while I continued to work for a government salary that barely covered my basic expenses. But there was something else troubling Dmitri, something beyond just the financial fraud. Alexander, he said carefully, there is another aspect to this situation that concerns me greatly: the information Jessica has been providing, the level of detail and accuracy. It suggests access to highly classified materials. Information that would be extremely valuable to foreign governments or corporate entities who might not have America's best interests at heart. The implication hit me like a physical blow. Jessica wasn't just stealing from me personally, she was potentially compromising national security by selling strategic information about American energy infrastructure to international investors. The reports I'd written, the vulnerabilities I'd identified, the contingency plans I'd helped develop, all of it could be used against American interests if it fell into the wrong hands. I need to ask you directly, Dmitri said, his voice grave. Has Jessica ever had access to your computer, your files, your work communications? Have you ever shared login credentials with her, or allowed her to use your work equipment for any reason? I tried to think back, my mind racing through years of family interactions and visits home. There had been times when Jessica was at my apartment in Albany, usually during holidays or family emergencies, when she needed a place to stay in the capital region for business meetings. I'd been generous with my space and resources, never thinking twice about letting her use my computer to check email or print documents. I'd even given her my Wi-Fi password and allowed her to work from my home office. When she claimed her hotel internet was unreliable, she's stayed at my apartment several times, I admitted. She's used my computer, my printer. I never thought it was a problem. Family helping family, you know? Dmitri nodded grimly. That would explain how she gained access to your files, your email communications with government contacts, your draft reports and policy analyses. With physical access to your equipment, someone with technical knowledge could easily copy everything. The betrayal was so comprehensive, so calculating, that I struggled to process it. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision or a single mistake in judgment. Jessica had been systematically stealing from me for over a year, building a business empire on my professional work while simultaneously ensuring I remained marginalized within the family structure. She'd been treating me like an inconvenient burden while secretly profiting from my expertise and endangering national security in the process. But why? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Why would she do this to me? Why not just ask for help, include me as a partner, share the profits? Why steal everything and leave me sleeping in a garage? Dmitri was quiet for a long moment, considering his response. I have been wondering the same thing, he said finally. From a purely business perspective, it would have been far more profitable and sustainable to work with you directly rather than around you. He stood up and began pacing the small garage space, his expensive shoes clicking against the concrete floor. But watching your family dynamics over the past few days, I believe I understand the psychology. Jessica needed you to remain small, invisible, undervalued by your family, so that no one would pay attention to your professional activities. If your parents and brother knew about your international reputation and consulting potential, they might ask questions about your finances, your travel, your business relationships. The truth was even worse than I'd imagined. Jessica hadn't just stolen my work, she'd orchestrated an entire family dynamic designed to keep me isolated and diminished so that her theft would go unnoticed. Every time my family had dismissed my career as boring government work, every time they'd treated me as the least important member of the family, they'd been enabling Jessica's fraud. She needed you to feel grateful for scraps, Dmitri continued. Grateful for a sleeping bag in the garage, grateful to be included at all. Because someone who feels valued and confident might start asking questions about why their expertise isn't being properly compensated, why international consultants aren't calling them directly, why they're not being invited to participate in the kind of high-level discussions their qualifications should warrant. I thought about all the times I'd wondered why my career hadn't progressed faster, why I wasn't getting the recognition or opportunities I felt I deserved. I'd blamed myself, assumed I wasn't networking effectively or marketing my skills properly. I'd never considered that someone might be actively working to prevent my professional advancement while profiting from my work behind the scenes. The worst part was how perfectly Jessica had played her role as the successful sister who had her life together while I struggled with basic things like career advancement and financial stability. She'd used my own professional work to fund her lifestyle and business ventures, then had the audacity to act like she was the accomplished one while I was the family disappointment who needed to sleep in the garage. Alexander, Dmitri said, stopping his pacing and looking directly at me, I need to tell you something else. Something that may be even more difficult to hear. When I first contacted Jessica about doing business, I mentioned that I was specifically interested in working with Alexander Mitchell, the energy consultant. Her response was very telling. She said that you were brilliant but unstable, that you had struggled with mental health issues that made direct business relationships complicated. My blood ran cold. She said what? She told me you had a history of anxiety and depression that made you unreliable for high-pressure consulting work, that you preferred the stability of government employment because private sector demands were too stressful for you to handle. She presented herself as a protective sister who was helping you monetize your expertise in a way that wouldn't compromise your emotional well-being. The calculated cruelty of it took my breath away. Jessica hadn't just stolen my work and profits, she'd actively sabotaged my professional reputation by spreading lies about my mental health and reliability. She'd created a narrative where I was too fragile and unstable to handle direct business relationships, ensuring that potential clients would work through her rather than approach me directly. That is why I never attempted to contact you directly about the European position, Dmitri explained. Jessica convinced me that surprising you with unsolicited job offers would be harmful to your mental state, that all professional opportunities should be filtered through her to ensure they were presented in a way that wouldn't trigger anxiety episodes. She was very convincing, very concerned, very protective. It seemed like genuine sisterly devotion. I sat there on the deflated air mattress, surrounded by concrete walls and storage boxes, realizing that everything I'd believed about my relationship with my sister was a lie. She hadn't been protecting me or helping me, she'd been systematically destroying my professional reputation while stealing the fruits of my labor. Every moment of self-doubt I'd experienced, every time I'd wondered why my career wasn't advancing despite my qualifications, had been the result of Jessica's deliberate sabotage. But there was still something I didn't understand. How did she know enough about my work to convincingly discuss technical details with someone like Dmitri? How had she managed to provide accurate information about classified projects and international energy policies? The answer, when it came to me, was almost too awful to contemplate. She's been reading everything I said aloud, the pieces finally clicking into place. My emails, my reports, my correspondence with international contacts. She's been monitoring my work communications for months, maybe longer. That's how she knew about the European grid analysis, the Ukrainian protocols, all of it. She's essentially been conducting industrial espionage against her own brother. Dmitri nodded gravely. The level of access she would need to provide the kind of detailed information she's been sharing, it would require complete penetration of your professional communications. Not just occasional glimpses, but comprehensive, ongoing surveillance of your work product and correspondence. It represents a massive violation of both personal trust and professional ethics. The garage felt like it was closing in around me as I contemplated the full scope of Jessica's betrayal. She hadn't just stolen money or opportunities, she'd violated every aspect of my professional and personal life. She'd turned my own family against me, convinced them I was the problematic sibling who needed to be managed and contained, all while she built a fortune on my professional reputation. And the timing of Dmitri's visit suddenly made perfect sense. Jessica had brought him here not to discuss business opportunities with me, but to show him how effectively she'd marginalized me within my own family. Having me sleep in the garage while he stayed in my childhood bedroom wasn't just about space constraints, it was a demonstration of her complete control over my family relationships and social standing. She wanted you to see me like this, I said. the realization hitting me like a punch to the stomach. Sleeping in the garage, treated like an unwanted burden, grateful for scraps of attention from my own family. She wanted to prove to you that I'm exactly what she claimed, someone too pathetic and unstable to handle direct business relationships. Dmitri's expression darkened. I believe you are correct, and I must tell you, it was very convincing. If I had not already known your professional reputation, if I had not spent years hearing energy ministers praise your work, I might have accepted her characterization of you at face value. She has orchestrated this situation very carefully, very deliberately. But now that I understood what Jessica had done, I needed to understand why the rest of my family had been so willing to participate in my marginalization. Were they complicit in her scheme, or were they simply indifferent to how I was treated? The answer would determine not just how I responded to Jessica's betrayal, but whether I had any family relationships worth preserving. There's something else, isn't there? I asked Dmitri. Something about my family, about why they've been treating me this way. You've been watching them for 3 days, and you've figured something out. Dmitri hesitated, clearly reluctant to share whatever insight he'd gained during his stay in the Mitchell household. Alexander, he said finally, I have spent considerable time with your parents and brother over the past few days. I have observed their interactions, their attitudes, their priorities. And I have come to believe that Jessica's ability to manipulate this family dynamic runs much deeper than simple fraud. There are patterns here established over many years that suggest a level of coordination that goes beyond what any single person could accomplish alone. My heart started racing as I considered the implications of what he was suggesting. You think they're all involved? You think my parents and Kevin know what Jessica's been doing? Dmitri shook his head slowly. Not necessarily aware of the specifics of her business activities, but certainly complicit in maintaining the family structure that enables her to operate without scrutiny. They benefit from Jessica's apparent success while ensuring that you remain dependent and marginalized. He pulled out his phone again and showed me a series of photographs he'd taken during family conversations over the past 3 days. Your parents have received significant financial support from Jessica over the past year, he explained. I have observed discussions about mortgage payments, medical bills, home improvements, all funded by Jessica's consulting income. Money that, as we now know, was derived from stealing your professional work. The betrayal went deeper than I'd imagined. Not only had Jessica been stealing from me and sabotaging my reputation, she'd been using the profits to buy my family's loyalty and complicity in my marginalization. My parents weren't just indifferent to how I was treated, they were financially invested in maintaining a family dynamic that kept me small and grateful while Jessica appeared successful and generous. Your brother Kevin has received business loans from Jessica totaling over $200,000, Dmitri continued. His construction company was failing 2 years ago, but Jessica's financial backing allowed him to stay afloat and expand. In return, he has become fiercely protective of Jessica's interests and dismissive of any concerns about how you're treated. I thought about Kevin's behavior over the past few days, how he'd seemed apologetic about my garage sleeping arrangement but hadn't offered his own couch or guest room as an alternative. He'd been genuinely sorry that I was uncomfortable, but not sorry enough to do anything that might displease Jessica or jeopardize the financial support that was keeping his business viable. The most disturbing aspect, Dmitri said, is how naturally this dynamic appears to function. It is not forced or artificial, it has become the established family culture. Jessica is the successful provider, your parents are the grateful recipients of her generosity, Kevin is the loyal brother who supports the family's benefactor, and you are the problematic outsider who should be grateful for whatever inclusion you receive. I sat in the cold garage, surrounded by the detritus of my childhood, finally understanding that my family's treatment of me wasn't the result of neglect or indifference. It was the product of a carefully constructed system designed to keep me powerless while others profited from my work. Jessica had bought my family's participation in my own marginalization, and they'd accepted the arrangement willingly. But what I couldn't understand was how this had been allowed to continue for so long without anyone questioning the obviously dysfunctional dynamic. Surely someone should have noticed that the family's treatment of me was disproportionate and cruel, that something was fundamentally wrong with relegating a successful professional to sleeping in a garage while celebrating the achievements of someone whose success was built on theft and fraud. The answer, when Dmitri provided it, revealed the final piece of Jessica's comprehensive manipulation of my family relationships. "There is one more thing you need to know," he said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "Yesterday, while you were helping your mother in the kitchen, I overheard a conversation between Jessica and your parents about your future. They were discussing the possibility of having you declared incompetent to handle your own financial affairs, with Jessica appointed as your legal guardian and financial manager." The words hit me like ice water. They want to what? Jessica has convinced them that your ongoing financial struggles and career stagnation are evidence of underlying incompetence that will only worsen with time. She has suggested that the family needs to take proactive steps to ensure you're properly cared for before your supposed mental health issues become more severe. I couldn't breathe. Jessica wasn't just stealing from me in the present, she was planning to formalize her theft through legal guardianship that would give her complete control over my finances and professional decisions. She was trying to have me declared legally incompetent so that she could continue profiting from my work indefinitely while maintaining the appearance of being a caring sister protecting her disabled sibling. "The plan is remarkably comprehensive," Dmitri continued. "Jessica would manage your government salary and any consulting income, ensuring that your basic needs are met while she controls the majority of your earnings for investment purposes that would benefit the entire family. You would be allowed to continue working, but under financial supervision that would prevent you from making what she characterizes as poor decisions about money and career opportunities." I thought about all the times Jessica had offered unsolicited advice about my finances, suggesting I was too impulsive with money and needed better guidance about budgeting and investments. She'd criticized my apartment as too expensive, my car as an unnecessary luxury, my occasional vacations as fiscally irresponsible. I'd dismissed her comments as typical sister criticism, never realizing she was building a case for legal incompetence that would allow her to control every aspect of my financial life. "Your parents are receptive to the idea," Dmitri said gently. "They have observed your apparent lack of financial success despite your education and government position, and Jessica has convinced them that professional management of your resources would be in your best interests. They genuinely believe they would be helping you by removing the burden of financial decision-making from your shoulders." The systematic nature of Jessica's plan was breathtaking in its scope and cruelty. She'd stolen my professional work to fund her lifestyle and business ventures, used the profits to buy my family's loyalty, spread lies about my mental health to prevent direct business relationships that might expose her fraud, and now she was planning to formalize her theft through legal guardianship that would give her permanent control over my earnings and professional opportunities. But as I sat there in the garage, processing the full extent of my sister's betrayal and my family's complicity, I felt something shifting inside me. The hurt and confusion were being replaced by something harder, more focused. For the first time in years, I wasn't wondering what I'd done wrong or how I could earn my family's approval. Instead, I was calculating how to protect myself and expose the truth about what had been done to me. Jessica had made one critical mistake in her comprehensive manipulation of my family and professional life. She'd brought Dmitri here to demonstrate her control over me, to show him how effectively she'd marginalized me within my own family structure. But instead of confirming her narrative about my incompetence and instability, his visit had exposed the truth about her systematic theft and fraud. Now I had an ally who understood both my professional value and the scope of Jessica's deception. More importantly, I had evidence of her crimes and a witness to her family manipulation. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had the tools I needed to fight back and reclaim control over my own life. The question was no longer why this had happened to me, but what I was going to do about it. And as I looked at Dmitri, seeing respect and concern in his expression instead of the dismissal and indifference I'd grown accustomed to from my family, I realized that I was finally ready to stop being a victim and start being the internationally respected energy consultant that I'd apparently been all along. The garage might be cold and uncomfortable, but it was about to become the birthplace of my liberation from years of systematic abuse and theft. Jessica had brought me to rock bottom, but she'd also inadvertently provided me with everything I needed to rise back up and reclaim my life on my own terms. Part 6 Introduction. The investigation begins. The first thing I did after Dmitri left the garage was check my laptop. My hands shook as I opened it, expecting to find evidence of tampering, but everything looked normal on the surface. My files were exactly where I'd left them, my browser history showed only my usual work-related searches, and my email appeared untouched. But appearances could be deceiving, especially when dealing with someone as calculating as Jessica had proven to be. I spent the next 2 hours methodically examining my digital footprint, looking for signs of unauthorized access or data theft. What I found was far more sophisticated than I'd expected. Jessica hadn't simply copied files or forwarded emails to herself. She'd installed remote monitoring software that gave her complete access to everything I did on my computer, from the reports I wrote to the classified briefings I received to the personal communications I thought were private. The software was professional grade, the kind used by corporations for employee monitoring or by intelligence agencies for surveillance operations. It ran silently in the background, invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for, and it had been active for over 18 months. Every keystroke I'd made, every document I'd opened, every email I'd sent or received had been recorded and transmitted to Jessica's servers in real time. The scope of the surveillance was staggering. She'd watched me develop the European grid analysis that had prevented the continental blackouts, monitored my communications with NATO energy officials during the Ukrainian crisis, and observed my work on classified infrastructure assessments that could affect national security. She'd essentially turned me into an unwitting spy against my own country, stealing information that was valuable not just to international investors but potentially to foreign governments. But what disturbed me most was realizing that Jessica had been watching my personal life as well. She'd seen my dating attempts, my financial struggles, my private conversations with friends about feeling isolated from the family. She'd monitored my therapy sessions conducted over secure video calls, my medical consultations, even my online shopping habits and entertainment choices. There was literally nothing about my life that had remained private from her surveillance. I sat in the cold garage, staring at the evidence of my sister's comprehensive violation of my privacy and professional ethics, feeling a mixture of rage and violation that was almost overwhelming. This wasn't just theft or fraud, it was a level of systematic abuse that bordered on psychological torture. Jessica had turned my own technology against me, using my computer as a weapon to destroy my professional reputation while building her own fortune. The monitoring software also explained how Jessica had been able to stay one step ahead of any potential discoveries. She'd watched me research consulting opportunities, monitored my communications with potential employers, and even observed my personal conversations about feeling undervalued in my career. Every time I'd taken steps to advance professionally or investigate why my opportunities seemed limited, she'd known about it immediately and could take countermeasures. I thought about all the times over the past year when potential opportunities had mysteriously fallen through. The private sector consulting position that had been withdrawn after the company claimed they'd received concerning information about my reliability. The academic fellowship that had been rescinded due to unspecified issues with my background check. The international conference speaking invitation that had been cancelled when the organizers said they'd been advised I might not be suitable for their audience. Jessica hadn't just been stealing my work, she'd been actively sabotaging my career advancement to ensure I remained dependent on my government salary and isolated from the professional networks that might have exposed her fraud. Every disappointment I'd experienced, every closed door and missed opportunity had been the result of her deliberate interference in my professional life. But now that I understood what had been done to me, I could begin to fight back. The first step was documenting everything I'd discovered, creating a comprehensive record of Jessica's surveillance and theft that could be used as evidence if legal action became necessary. I spent the rest of the night carefully screenshotting the monitoring software, copying file access logs, and creating a detailed timeline of when my work had been stolen and how it had been used. The evidence was overwhelming. I could trace specific reports and analyses from my government work directly to consulting documents that Jessica had provided to Dmitri and presumably other clients. She'd taken classified information about energy infrastructure vulnerabilities and repackaged it as investment advice, potentially compromising national security for personal profit. More damaging still, I found communications between Jessica and several other wealthy international clients, including what appeared to be representatives of foreign governments interested in American energy policies and infrastructure weaknesses. She hadn't just been stealing from me and defrauding investors, she'd been selling sensitive information about American national security to anyone willing to pay her consulting fees. The full scope of Jessica's operation was staggering in its ambition and criminality. She built a multi-million-dollar international consulting business based entirely on stolen classified information, while simultaneously destroying my professional reputation and family relationships to prevent discovery. It was corporate espionage, identity theft, fraud, and potentially treason all rolled into one comprehensive scheme. As dawn began to break over Binghamton, I realized I was no longer just dealing with family dysfunction or sibling rivalry. I was uncovering what amounted to a sophisticated intelligence operation run by my own sister, using my professional expertise and security clearances to generate enormous profits while compromising American national security interests. The garage felt different in the morning light, less like a place of exile and more like a war room where I was planning my counterattack. I had evidence of Jessica's crimes, an ally in Dmitri who understood both my professional value and the scope of her deception, and for the first time in years, I had clarity about why my life had been so systematically undermined. But I also understood that Jessica's operation was too sophisticated and well-established to have been developed by someone without extensive resources and expertise. The monitoring software, the international client networks, the professional document forgeries, all of it suggested that she had help from people with intelligence backgrounds or corporate espionage experience. I spent the morning researching Jessica's business associates and consulting clients, using my government access to databases that could reveal connections she might not want exposed. What I found confirmed my suspicions about the scope of her operation and added several new layers of complexity to an already challenging situation. Jessica's consulting firm, which she'd registered under the innocuous name Strategic Energy Solutions, had received funding from a network of shell companies traced back to foreign intelligence services and corporations with known ties to hostile governments. She wasn't just stealing my work for financial gain, she was part of a larger operation designed to penetrate American energy infrastructure planning and policy development. The revelation that my sister was potentially a foreign asset fundamentally changed the nature of the situation. This was no longer just about family betrayal or professional theft, it was about national security and my own potential legal jeopardy if I was seen as complicit in her activities. My security clearance, my government position, even my freedom could be at risk if Jessica's operation was exposed and I was viewed as a willing participant rather than an unknowing victim. I needed help, but I couldn't approach my normal support networks without risking exposure of classified information or alerting Jessica to my discovery of her surveillance. I couldn't contact my government supervisors without potentially triggering an investigation that might destroy my career before I could prove my innocence, and I certainly couldn't trust my family, who had proven themselves willing to participate in my marginalization for financial benefit. The only person I could trust was Dmitri, who had both the resources to help me and the motivation to see Jessica's fraud exposed. But approaching him for assistance would require revealing classified information about American energy policies and infrastructure, potentially violating my oath of office and security clearance requirements. I was trapped between the need to expose Jessica's crimes and the legal obligations that prevented me from sharing the evidence I'd gathered. If I revealed what I'd discovered, I might be prosecuted for disclosing classified information. If I remained silent, Jessica would continue her operation and potentially cause enormous damage to American national security while destroying my life in the process. The solution, when it came to me, required a level of strategic thinking that I'd never applied to personal relationships. I needed to expose Jessica's operation without revealing classified information, gather additional evidence without alerting her to my investigation, and protect myself legally while ensuring that justice was served. The first step was confirming that Dmitri wasn't complicit in Jessica's larger operation. While he appeared genuinely shocked by the scope of her deception, he was still a Russian billionaire with potential ties to intelligence services and foreign policy objectives that might not align with American interests. I needed to verify his trustworthiness before revealing the full extent of what I'd discovered. I spent the afternoon researching Dmitri's background using open-source intelligence techniques, examining his business relationships, political connections, and financial activities for signs that he might be more than just an innocent victim of Jessica's fraud. What I found was reassuring but not conclusive. Dmitri appeared to be exactly what he claimed, a legitimate businessman with interests in renewable energy and infrastructure development, but appearances could be deceiving in the world of international intelligence operations. The key test would be how he responded when I presented him with evidence of Jessica's broader criminal activities without revealing the classified aspects of her theft. If he was part of her operation, he would try to deflect or minimize the significance of what I'd discovered. If he was truly an innocent victim, he would be outraged and eager to cooperate with efforts to expose her crimes. I arranged to meet Dmitri that evening at a coffee shop in downtown Binghamton, far from the family house in Jessica's potential surveillance. I needed neutral ground for a conversation that could determine whether I had a powerful ally or another enemy in my fight to reclaim my life and protect national security. The coffee shop was nearly empty when I arrived, just a few college students studying for finals and an elderly couple sharing pie and
Reminiscing about their early years together, Dmitri was already there, sitting in a corner booth with his back to the wall, a habit that suggested either paranoia or professional training in personal security. He looked tired in the artificial light, older than he had in the comfortable glow of my family's dining room. The past few days had clearly taken a toll on him as well, as he processed the reality of Jessica's deception and reconsidered all of their business interactions through the lens of fraud and manipulation. "Alexander," he said as I approached, his accent thicker than usual with exhaustion, "I have been thinking about our conversation last night, and I have some concerns about the situation that go beyond what we discussed. I need to know if you are prepared to hear difficult truths about your sister's activities that may have implications far beyond family relationships." I sat down across from him, noting the careful way he'd phrased his statement to avoid specifics that might be overheard by other customers. His caution suggested that he'd reached similar conclusions about the scope of Jessica's operation and the potential risks involved in exposing it. "I've discovered some things too," I said carefully, "things that suggest Jessica's consulting business is more complicated than either of us initially realized. I need to know if you're willing to cooperate with efforts to investigate her activities, even if it means potential legal and financial consequences for both of us." Dmitri nodded grimly. "I have been conducting my own investigation since our conversation, examining Jessica's consulting services and client base more carefully. What I have found is deeply concerning, both from a business ethics standpoint and potentially from a national security perspective." He pulled out a tablet and showed me a series of documents that made my blood run cold. Financial records showing payments from Jessica's consulting firm to accounts linked to foreign intelligence services. Communications discussing the sale of sensitive information about American energy infrastructure to buyers whose interests were clearly hostile to American national security. Evidence that Jessica's operation was far larger and more dangerous than either of us had initially understood. "Alexander," Dmitri said quietly, I believe your sister is engaged in activities that constitute espionage against your country. The information she has been selling, the clients she has been serving, the network of contacts she has developed, all of it suggests a sophisticated intelligence operation designed to penetrate American energy security planning. I stared at the evidence he'd compiled, seeing confirmation of my own discoveries but also new information that revealed the international scope of Jessica's betrayal. She wasn't just stealing from me and defrauding investors, she was part of a foreign intelligence network that was using my professional work to compromise American national security. The implications were staggering. Every report I'd written, every briefing I'd attended, every classified analysis I'd developed had potentially been transmitted to foreign governments hostile to American interests. My work on infrastructure vulnerabilities could be used to plan attacks on American power grids. My assessments of European energy security could be used to manipulate international energy markets. My communications with NATO allies could be used to compromise collective security arrangements. I need to ask you directly, Dmitri said, his voice barely above a whisper. Are you willing to cooperate with law enforcement agencies to expose Jessica's operation, even if it means potential legal jeopardy for yourself as an unwitting source of classified information? Are you prepared to risk your career and possibly your freedom to ensure that this threat to national security is eliminated? The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. Everything I'd worked for, my security clearance, my government position, my professional reputation, could be destroyed if I was seen as complicit in Jessica's operation. But if I remained silent, the damage to national security could be catastrophic, and Jessica would continue profiting from my work while systematically destroying my life. I looked at Dmitri, seeing genuine concern and respect in his expression, and realized that this was the moment when I had to decide what kind of person I wanted to be. I could continue being the victim who accepted whatever scraps of dignity my family was willing to provide, or I could become someone who took action to protect both my own interests and my country's security. Yes, I said finally. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to stop Jessica and expose her operation. But I need your help to do it safely and effectively. I can't approach law enforcement directly without risking my security clearance and career, but together we might be able to find a way to expose her crimes while protecting both of us from legal jeopardy. Dmitri smiled for the first time since I'd known him, an expression of genuine warmth and respect that no member of my family had ever directed toward me. Then we have much work to do, Alexander. But I believe we can succeed in stopping your sister while ensuring that you receive the recognition and opportunities that your expertise deserves. As we began planning our investigation into Jessica's espionage operation, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope, not the desperate, grasping hope for family acceptance that had driven me to sleep in garages and accept whatever treatment was offered, but genuine optimism based on my own abilities and the respect of someone who understood my value. The garage might have been cold and uncomfortable, but it had become the birthplace of my transformation from victim to someone who would fight for justice and protection of national security. Jessica had brought me to rock bottom, but she'd also inadvertently provided me with the motivation and allies I needed to rise back up stronger than ever before. The investigation was just beginning, but I was no longer afraid of what we might discover. I was finally ready to reclaim my life and ensure that those who had betrayed my trust faced the consequences of their actions. The final confrontation and resolution, the plan Dmitri and I developed, was elegantly simple in concept but required precise execution to avoid legal complications for either of us. We would document Jessica's fraud and espionage activities using only information that Dmitri had legally obtained as her client, combined with evidence of her surveillance that I could reveal without disclosing classified details. The key was building a case that law enforcement could pursue independently. without requiring me to breach my security clearance obligations. Dmitri's resources proved invaluable in ways I hadn't anticipated. Within 48 hours of our coffee shop meeting, he'd hired a team of cybersecurity experts to conduct a comprehensive analysis of Jessica's digital infrastructure. What they discovered was a sophisticated operation that extended far beyond simple theft of my work product. Jessica had created an entire network of false identities and shell companies designed to obscure the source of her consulting intelligence and the destination of her profits. She maintained server farms in 3 different countries, used encrypted communication systems typically employed by intelligence agencies, and had established financial accounts in jurisdictions known for protecting the assets of individuals engaged in questionable activities. The cybersecurity team also uncovered evidence that Jessica had been conducting similar operations against other government employees with access to sensitive information. I wasn't her only victim, just the most profitable one due to my specialized expertise and security clearances. She'd been running what amounted to a small-scale intelligence harvesting operation, targeting family members and close associates of government workers to gain access to classified information. But most damaging of all, they found communications between Jessica and handlers who were clearly foreign intelligence operatives. She hadn't just stumbled into espionage for financial gain, she'd been recruited and trained by professionals who understood exactly how to exploit family relationships and personal vulnerabilities to penetrate American national security infrastructure. The evidence was overwhelming and completely damning, but it also revealed how carefully Jessica had insulated herself from direct legal consequences. The shell companies, offshore accounts, and encrypted communications were all designed to make prosecution difficult and potentially impossible under traditional law enforcement approaches. That's when Dmitri suggested a different strategy altogether. Instead of trying to build a criminal case that might take years to develop and could be defeated by Jessica's sophisticated legal defenses, we would expose her operation publicly and let the court of public opinion force law enforcement to take action. The plan required me to take enormous personal and professional risks, but the alternative was allowing Jessica to continue her operation indefinitely, while my life remained systematically destroyed. I would have to trust that the truth was compelling enough to protect me from retaliation, and that my professional reputation was strong enough to survive the scrutiny that would inevitably follow. We spent a week gathering additional evidence and preparing our public disclosure strategy. Dmitri used his business connections to arrange interviews with investigative journalists who specialized in national security issues, while I compiled a comprehensive timeline of Jessica's surveillance and theft that could be understood by people without security clearances. The most challenging aspect was deciding how much to reveal about my own work and expertise without compromising classified information. I had to find ways to describe the value and sensitivity of what Jessica had stolen, without providing details that could further damage national security if disclosed publicly. The solution was focusing on the methods rather than the content of Jessica's operation. I could describe how she'd gained unauthorized access to government communications, how she'd sold unspecified sensitive information to foreign clients, and how she'd used family relationships to exploit national security vulnerabilities without revealing the specific classified details of my work. But before we could proceed with public disclosure, we needed to confront Jessica directly and give her an opportunity to cease her activities voluntarily. Dmitri insisted this was both legally and ethically necessary, though we both understood it was unlikely to succeed, given the scope and sophistication of her operation. The confrontation took place on Sunday morning, the day after Thanksgiving, in my parents' living room with the entire family present. Dmitri had requested a family meeting to discuss business matters, ostensibly to finalize consulting arrangements that Jessica had been negotiating on my behalf. Jessica appeared confident and composed as we gathered around the coffee table, where she'd laid out professionally printed folders containing what she claimed were consulting contracts and partnership agreements. She'd prepared an elaborate presentation about the international opportunities she'd secured for my expertise, complete with financial projections and timeline charts. For the first few minutes, I watched her perform the role of the successful sister who was generously helping her struggling brother access opportunities he couldn't secure on his own. She spoke eloquently about my qualifications and potential, describing me as a hidden gem in the energy consulting world, who just needed proper representation to achieve his full earning capacity. My parents and Kevin listened with obvious pride and gratitude, clearly believing that Jessica was about to solve my career problems while generating significant income for the entire family. They looked at her with the kind of admiration and respect that I'd never seen directed toward me, even when I'd achieved genuine professional success. But Dmitri wasn't playing along with Jessica's presentation. He sat quietly, occasionally nodding politely, but his expression remained neutral and unreadable. When Jessica finally finished her elaborate pitch and asked for his thoughts on the proposed arrangements, he smiled and pulled out his own folder. "Jessica," he said calmly, "I appreciate your presentation, but I'm afraid there are some aspects of our business relationship that need clarification before we can proceed." He opened his folder and began laying out printed copies of financial records, communication logs and surveillance evidence that documented the scope of her fraud and espionage activities. The change in Jessica's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. Her confident smile vanished, replaced by a look of barely controlled panic as she recognized the documents Dmitri was displaying. She glanced quickly around the room, clearly calculating whether she could somehow minimize or deflect the evidence he was presenting. "These records show that over the past 18 months, you have received approximately $2.8 million in consulting fees for providing clients with information that was obtained through unauthorized surveillance of Alexander's professional communications," Dmitri continued, his voice remaining conversational despite the explosive nature of his accusations. My parents and Kevin stared at the documents in confusion, not yet understanding the implications of what they were seeing. Jessica attempted to maintain her composure, but I could see her hands trembling as she tried to organize a response to allegations she hadn't expected to face. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," she said carefully. "The consulting services I've provided were based on publicly available information and general industry knowledge. Any suggestion that I've engaged in unauthorized activities is completely unfounded and potentially defamatory." But Dmitri wasn't finished. He pulled out additional documents showing the monitoring software that had been installed on my computer, financial records tracing payments to foreign intelligence services, and communications discussing the sale of sensitive information about American energy infrastructure to buyers whose interests were clearly hostile to American national security. "Jessica, these records show that you've been conducting comprehensive surveillance of Alexander's professional activities, stealing classified information and selling that information to foreign governments and intelligence services. This isn't a business dispute. It's evidence of espionage and treason." The room went completely silent as the full scope of Jessica's activities became clear to everyone present. My parents looked back and forth between the evidence and their daughter, clearly struggling to process allegations that seemed incompatible with the successful caring sister they thought they knew. Kevin was the first to speak, his voice tight with disbelief. "Jessica, tell me this isn't true. Tell me you haven't been stealing from Alex and selling secrets to foreign governments." The pain in his voice was evident as he realized that the financial support that had saved his business might have been funded by activities that amounted to treason. Jessica tried one more time to deflect and minimize the evidence, claiming that the documents were taken out of context and that her consulting services were completely legitimate. But her denials sounded hollow, even to her own ears, particularly when confronted with communication logs that showed her explicitly discussing the theft of classified information with foreign intelligence operatives. Mom finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jessica, how could you do this to Alex? How could you do this to our country?" The betrayal was written across her face as she began to understand that her daughter had not only stolen from her son but had potentially compromised national security for personal profit. Dad's reaction was even more devastating. He stood up slowly, his face pale with shock and disgust, and walked out of the room without saying a word. The sound of the front door slamming echoed through the house like a gunshot, leaving the rest of us to sit in uncomfortable silence. But I wasn't interested in family drama or emotional reconciliation. I had my own questions for Jessica, and this might be my only opportunity to get answers before law enforcement became involved, and she lawyered up completely. "I need to know how long this has been going on," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "How long have you been stealing my work and selling it to foreign governments?" Jessica looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of defiance and calculation that suggested she was evaluating whether honesty or continued deception would serve her interests better. "2 years," she said finally. "Maybe a little longer. It started small, just monitoring your email to understand your work better, so I could help you network more effectively. But when I realized how valuable your expertise was to international clients, I saw an opportunity to build something bigger." The casual way she described her systematic violation of my privacy and theft of classified information was almost as shocking as the acts themselves. She spoke about espionage and treason as if they were routine business decisions, betraying no remorse or recognition of the harm she'd caused to me personally or to national security. "You destroyed my career prospects," I said, struggling to keep my voice level. "You spread lies about my mental health, sabotaged my job opportunities, and convinced our family that I was incompetent and unstable. Why not just ask me to partner with you instead of stealing everything and destroying my reputation?" Jessica's response revealed the depth of her narcissism and contempt for me that I'd never fully recognized. "Because you would have wanted credit," she said matter-of-factly. "You would have wanted recognition for your expertise and achievements. But clients don't want to work with government bureaucrats who have security clearance restrictions and ethical limitations. They want consultants who can provide information without institutional constraints." She paused, seeming to organize her thoughts before delivering what amounted to a final insult. "Besides, you were never going to maximize the value of your expertise on your own. You're too honest, too concerned with rules and regulations. I took your knowledge and turned it into something profitable and useful. You should be grateful that I found ways to monetize capabilities you were wasting in government service." The breathtaking arrogance of her justification left me speechless for a moment. She genuinely believed that stealing my work and selling classified information to foreign governments was a favor she'd done for me, that I should be grateful for her criminal exploitation of my expertise and security clearances. But Kevin's reaction was even more intense than mine. He stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger and disgust. "Jessica, you're talking about treason. You stole classified information and sold it to foreign governments. Alex could have gone to prison because of what you did. We all could have been prosecuted as accessories if anyone thought we knew about your activities." Mom was crying now, the full implications of Jessica's crimes finally becoming clear to her. The daughter she'd been so proud of, whose success she'd celebrated and financial generosity she'd gratefully accepted, was revealed to be a criminal whose activities had endangered the entire family and potentially compromised national security. Jessica seemed genuinely surprised by their reactions, as if she'd expected them to understand and approve of her entrepreneurial approach to exploiting family relationships for profit. Her response revealed just how completely she disconnected from normal ethical considerations in pursuit of wealth and status. "You're all being ridiculously dramatic," she said, her voice taking on the condescending tone I remembered from childhood arguments. "International consulting is a complex business with gray areas that people outside the industry don't understand. What I did was aggressive, but not illegal, and certainly not treasonous." But Dmitri had one more piece of evidence that destroyed her final attempt at deflection and denial. He pulled out copies of communications between Jessica and foreign intelligence operatives that explicitly discussed her recruitment as an asset, her training in surveillance techniques, and her ongoing obligations to provide classified information about American energy infrastructure. "Jessica," he said quietly, "these communications show that you were recruited and trained by foreign intelligence services specifically to exploit your family relationship with Alexander. This wasn't opportunistic consulting, it was a planned espionage operation that you participated in knowingly and willingly." The evidence was irrefutable and completely damning. Jessica stared at the communications for a long moment, clearly recognizing that her situation had moved far beyond anything she could explain away or minimize. When she looked up, her expression had changed completely, revealing a cold calculation that was more frightening than her previous denials. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," she said, her voice now carrying a threatening undertone that I'd never heard before. "There are people involved in this who don't appreciate complications or exposure. If you think destroying my operation will solve your problems, you're naive about the forces you're dealing with." The implicit threat was clear, and it revealed that Jessica's espionage activities were part of a larger network that wouldn't simply disappear if she was exposed or prosecuted. But rather than intimidating me, her threat only strengthened my resolve to ensure that law enforcement had all the evidence they needed to dismantle the entire operation. Dmitri seemed unfazed by Jessica's threat, suggesting that he'd dealt with similar situations before and understood how to handle criminal organizations that relied on intimidation to protect their operations. "I think our business relationship is concluded, Jessica," he said calmly. "I'll be providing all of this evidence to the appropriate authorities, along with my testimony about your fraudulent consulting services." As the family meeting dissolved into chaos, with Mom crying, Kevin pacing angrily, and Jessica making increasingly desperate attempts to minimize the evidence against her, I felt a strange sense of peace settling over me. For the first time in years, I understood exactly why my life had been systematically undermined and who was responsible for the obstacles I'd faced. The garage where I'd spent Thanksgiving night suddenly seemed less like a place of exile and more like the location where I'd finally learned the truth about my family and my own value. Jessica's attempt to demonstrate my marginalization had instead provided me with the ally and evidence I needed to expose her crimes and reclaim my professional reputation, but the real transformation wasn't in my external circumstances. It was in my understanding of myself and my worth. I no longer needed my family's approval or recognition to validate my achievements. I had concrete evidence of my professional value from someone who understood international energy consulting, and I had the respect of someone who had initially been deceived by Jessica's lies but was now committed to helping me seek justice. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and lengthy, involving multiple federal agencies and international cooperation agreements. Jessica was eventually prosecuted for espionage, fraud, and violation of computer security laws, receiving a sentence that reflected the serious nature of her crimes against both her family and her country. But more importantly for my personal recovery, the investigation vindicated my professional reputation and led to opportunities that I could never have imagined while sleeping in that cold garage. The European Energy Council position that Dmitri had originally come to discuss became available again, this time with full knowledge of my qualifications and the circumstances that had prevented me from being approached directly. I accepted the position and moved to Brussels, where I now work directly with government officials and international organizations on the kind of high-level energy security issues that had made me valuable to Jessica's clients in the first place. My expertise is finally being recognized and compensated appropriately, without the criminal exploitation that had characterized my sister's operation. The garage might have been cold and uncomfortable, but it became the birthplace of my liberation from years of systematic abuse and theft. Jessica thought she was demonstrating her complete control over my family relationships and professional opportunities, but she inadvertently provided me with everything I needed to expose her crimes and build a new life based on my own achievements and capabilities. Sometimes the worst betrayals become the catalyst for the most profound transformations. I learned that my worth wasn't determined by my family's recognition or approval, but by my own actions and achievements. The respect I'd been seeking from people who were profiting from my marginalization was finally found with colleagues and clients who valued my expertise for what it actually was, rather than what they could steal from it. The last time I saw my family was at Jessica's sentencing hearing, where I testified about the impact of her crimes on both my personal life and national security. Mom and Dad looked older, diminished by the realization that they'd been unknowing accessories to espionage activities funded by the theft of their son's professional work. Kevin approached me afterward, clearly struggling with guilt about the financial support he'd received from Jessica's criminal activities. I forgave him, understanding that he'd been manipulated as much as I had, just in different ways. But I also made it clear that I wouldn't be returning to family gatherings or maintaining relationships that had been so fundamentally poisoned by years of systematic deception. The house in Binghamton, the garage where I'd discovered the truth about my life, all of it became part of a past that I'd finally moved beyond. I have a new life now, built on honest recognition of my abilities, and free from the toxic dynamics that had kept me small, and grateful for scraps of attention. I still think about that Thanksgiving weekend sometimes, not with bitterness, but with gratitude for the harsh lessons it taught me about family loyalty, professional worth, and personal dignity. The cold garage floor was uncomfortable, but it was also where I learned to stop accepting treatment that diminished my value, and started demanding the respect that my expertise and character deserved. Jessica's attempt to demonstrate my worthlessness instead revealed my true value to someone who understood international energy consulting. Her surveillance and theft provided the evidence needed to expose her entire criminal operation. Her manipulation of family relationships showed me the importance of building connections based on mutual respect rather than obligation and history. The energy minister that Dmitri had been looking for was never staying in a guest room or luxury hotel. He was sleeping on a deflated air mattress in a cold garage, unaware of his own international reputation but about to discover his true worth through the most unlikely circumstances imaginable. Sometimes the people who try hardest to diminish us end up being the catalyst for our greatest growth and success. Jessica spent years stealing my work and sabotaging my opportunities, but she ultimately provided me with the motivation and evidence I needed to build a career in life that far exceeded anything I could have achieved, while seeking approval from people who were profiting from my marginalization. The garage was cold, but it was also where I learned to stop being grateful for scraps and started demanding the recognition and opportunities that my expertise deserved. It was where I discovered that my worth wasn't determined by family dynamics or childhood roles, but by my own achievements and the respect of people who understood the value of what I could contribute to the world. The months following Jessica's arrest were a blur of interviews, depositions, and security debriefings. Federal investigators needed to understand the full scope of the compromise to
American energy infrastructure planning, which meant I spent countless hours explaining every report I'd written, every briefing I'd attended, and every communication I'd had with international colleagues over the past 2 years. The process was grueling and often humiliating. I had to admit to investigators that I'd been careless with my computer security, that I'd allowed family members access to my personal equipment, and that I'd failed to notice obvious signs of surveillance and data theft. Each admission felt like a confession of professional incompetence, even though the investigators repeatedly assured me that I was a victim rather than a perpetrator. What surprised me most was how supportive my government colleagues were once they understood what had happened. The director of the Energy Planning Board personally called to express his confidence in my integrity and professional abilities, assuring me that my security clearance would be maintained throughout the investigation. Several NATO energy officials I'd worked with on the European grid analysis sent messages of support, emphasizing that Jessica's crimes didn't diminish the value of my contributions to international energy security, but the validation that meant the most came from unexpected sources. Energy ministers from 3 European countries sent formal letters to the U.S. State Department praising my work and requesting that I be allowed to continue consulting on international infrastructure projects. Corporate executives who had unknowingly purchased stolen information from Jessica's consulting firm reached out to apologize and offer legitimate consulting contracts at rates that reflected my actual market value. Dmitri became an unlikely but invaluable friend during this period. He testified extensively about Jessica's fraud and helped investigators understand the international network she'd been part of, using his business connections to identify other victims and expose additional aspects of the espionage operation. His willingness to cooperate fully, despite the potential embarrassment and financial losses involved, demonstrated a level of integrity that I'd rarely encountered in my professional life. We met regularly at that same coffee shop in downtown Binghamton, discussing not just the legal proceedings but also my plans for the future. Dmitri insisted that I needed to think beyond simply surviving the investigation and focus on building the career and life that my expertise deserved. "Alexander," he said during one of our meetings, "you have spent your entire life trying to earn approval from people who were incapable of recognizing your value. Your family saw you as a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be celebrated. But now you have an opportunity to start fresh, to build relationships and professional networks based on mutual respect, rather than obligation and history." His words resonated deeply, touching on something I'd been struggling to articulate even to myself. The investigation into Jessica's crimes had exposed not just her fraud but the entire toxic family dynamic that had enabled it. My parents' willingness to accept her financial support without questioning its source, Kevin's readiness to believe lies about my mental health and competence, the whole family's casual dismissal of my professional achievements, all of it revealed a dysfunction that went far deeper than Jessica's individual criminality. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in family trauma and professional recovery. Dr. Patricia Hernandez helped me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't just sibling rivalry or normal family conflict, but systematic emotional abuse designed to keep me dependent and controllable. She helped me recognize patterns of manipulation and gaslighting that I'd internalized as normal family dynamics. The garage incident, she explained during one session, was a perfect microcosm of how your family had been treating you for years. They literally made you sleep outside the family structure while entertaining a guest, then expected you to be grateful for the opportunity to participate at all. It was a physical manifestation of your emotional and psychological position within the family hierarchy.
Understanding the deeper patterns helped me stop blaming myself for not recognizing Jessica's theft sooner or for accepting treatment that should have been obviously unacceptable. I began to see that I'd been conditioned from childhood to accept marginalization as normal, to view any inclusion as a privilege rather than a right, and to prioritize everyone else's needs and comfort above my own dignity and well-being. But therapy also helped me recognize my own strengths and resilience. Despite years of systematic undermining, I'd managed to build a genuinely impressive career and develop expertise that was valued internationally. I'd maintained my integrity and ethical standards even when working in isolation without recognition or appropriate compensation. And when confronted with evidence of betrayal, I'd chosen to act courageously rather than remain a passive victim. The European Energy Council position that Dmitri had originally come to discuss became available again once the investigation cleared me of any wrongdoing. The offer was even better than the original proposal, reflecting both my proven expertise and the additional credibility that came from surviving such a comprehensive security breach without compromising classified information. I accepted the position and began preparing for my move to Brussels. The logistics were complicated, requiring security clearances from multiple governments and coordination between American and European agencies, but the process felt more like an adventure than a burden. For the first time in my adult life, I was making career decisions based on opportunity and potential rather than family obligations and geographical proximity to people who didn't value my presence. My parents reached out several times during this period, attempting to rebuild a relationship that had been revealed as fundamentally hollow. Mom sent long emails apologizing for not recognizing Jessica's crimes and expressing pride in my professional achievements. Dad called weekly, trying to have conversations about my work and future plans that felt awkward and forced after years of indifference. I responded politely but maintained careful boundaries. I couldn't simply forgive years of marginalization and neglect because they'd finally realized I had value worth acknowledging. Their sudden interest in my life felt more like an attempt to salvage their own reputations than genuine remorse for how they'd treated me. Kevin's approach was different and more genuine. He drove to Albany to meet me in person, bringing financial records showing that he'd donated every dollar Jessica had given him to organizations supporting victims of fraud and financial crimes. He didn't make excuses or try to minimize his role in accepting money that had been stolen from me. He simply apologized and asked what he could do to begin making amends. I appreciated his directness and honesty, but I also made it clear that rebuilding trust would take time and consistent effort. He'd chosen to believe lies about my mental health and competence without ever asking for my side of the story, and that betrayal couldn't be erased by a single conversation or symbolic gesture. The hardest part of preparing for my new life in Brussels was deciding what relationship, if any, I wanted to maintain with my family going forward. Dr. Hernandez helped me understand that I didn't owe them continued access to my life simply because we shared DNA and history. Family relationships, like all relationships, needed to be based on mutual respect and genuine care rather than obligation and habit. I decided to maintain limited contact with my parents and Kevin, primarily through occasional emails and phone calls that allowed me to control the frequency and depth of our interactions. I made it clear that I wouldn't be returning to Binghamton for holidays or family gatherings, and that rebuilding relationships would require them to demonstrate consistent respect for my boundaries and acknowledgement of past harms. Jessica's trial was emotionally exhausting but also cathartic. Watching her attempt to justify her crimes and minimize her responsibility helped me understand just how deeply disordered her thinking had become. She genuinely seemed to believe that stealing classified information and selling it to foreign governments was a legitimate business strategy, and that I should be grateful for her entrepreneurial exploitation of my expertise. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of her espionage activities, including communications with foreign intelligence handlers, financial records showing millions in payments from hostile governments, and technical documentation of the sophisticated surveillance systems she'd used to monitor my work. The defense attempted to argue that she'd been manipulated by foreign operatives and didn't understand the serious nature of what she was doing, but the evidence of her calculated planning and deliberate deception made that argument absurd. When the judge sentenced Jessica to 15 years in federal prison, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that she'd been held accountable for her crimes, sadness that my sister had become someone capable of such profound betrayal, and anger that she'd stolen years of my life and professional development that could never be fully recovered. But more than anything, I felt a sense of closure that allowed me to finally stop dwelling on what had been done to me and focus on building the future I deserved. The move to Brussels was both exciting and terrifying. I was leaving behind everything familiar, including the toxic family dynamics that had defined my adult life, and stepping into a completely new professional and personal environment. But I was also finally getting the opportunity to work at the level my expertise warranted, with colleagues who understood and valued my contributions to international energy security. My first few months in Belgium were filled with professional challenges that stretched my capabilities in ways I'd never experienced in government service. I was suddenly working directly with energy ministers and corporate executives on projects that could affect millions of people, making decisions that required not just technical expertise but political savvy and interpersonal skills I'd never fully developed. But I also discovered that I thrived under these conditions. The skills I'd developed while navigating my toxic family dynamics, the ability to read subtle social cues and manage complex interpersonal situations, turned out to be valuable assets in international consulting. I could build consensus among stakeholders with competing interests, navigate cultural differences in business negotiations, and maintain professional relationships across language barriers and organizational boundaries. Dmitri introduced me to his network of international business contacts, many of whom became both colleagues and friends. I found myself attending conferences and policy discussions with people who had only been names in academic papers and news articles, contributing to conversations that shaped international energy policy at the highest levels. But the most meaningful transformation wasn't in my external circumstances or professional status, it was in my relationship with myself. I stopped seeking validation from people who were incapable of providing it, and started trusting my own judgment about my worth and capabilities. I learned to set boundaries without guilt, and to prioritize my own well-being without feeling selfish. The apartment I rented in Brussels was small but comfortable, with large windows overlooking a quiet street lined with chestnut trees. I furnished it simply, choosing pieces that I genuinely liked rather than trying to impress visitors or conform to some imagined standard of sophistication. For the first time in my adult life, I created a living space that reflected my own preferences and personality rather than what I thought others expected. I bought 2 comfortable chairs for my small dining table, but this time the second chair wasn't a desperate hope for family acceptance or a symbol of loneliness. It was a practical acknowledgement that I might occasionally have guests, colleagues who stopped by for coffee or friends who joined me for dinner. The chairs represented possibility rather than obligation, connection rather than desperation. 6 months after moving to Brussels, I received an unexpected package from my grandmother Eleanor, my father's mother, whom I'd barely seen since childhood. Inside was a handwritten letter, explaining that she'd learned about Jessica's crimes from news coverage of the trial, and wanted me to know that she'd always recognized my worth even when the rest of the family had failed to do so. She enclosed photographs from my childhood that I'd never seen before, images of me at various ages, looking genuinely happy and confident. In her letter, she explained that she'd tried to maintain a relationship with me, but that my parents had discouraged her involvement, claiming that too much attention would spoil me or give me unrealistic expectations about my importance to the family. Reading her letter, I realized that Jessica's manipulation of family relationships had been built on a foundation that predated her crimes by decades. My parents had been priming me for exploitation long before Jessica recognized the financial potential of my professional expertise. The garage incident wasn't an isolated cruelty, but the logical conclusion of years of systematic marginalization. But Eleanor's letter also reminded me that not everyone in my family had participated in or endorsed my mistreatment. She'd been marginalized herself for questioning family dynamics that she recognized as harmful, excluded from gatherings and decision-making because she refused to accept the narrative that I was somehow less deserving of respect and consideration than my siblings. I started corresponding with Eleanor regularly, building a relationship with someone who shared my DNA but not the toxic patterns that had defined my immediate family. She was 83 years old, sharp and independent, living in a retirement community in Florida, where she spent her days painting, gardening, and, as she put it, avoiding the kind of family drama that had poisoned so many relationships. Through our correspondence, I learned about family history that explained some of the dynamics I'd experienced growing up. My mother had been the youngest of 6 children in a family that practiced similar favoritism and marginalization, learning to compete for attention and resources by diminishing others. My father had grown up in a household where emotions were suppressed and achievements were dismissed, creating someone who was uncomfortable with recognizing or celebrating success in others. Understanding the generational patterns didn't excuse how I'd been treated, but it helped me see my parents as damaged people repeating cycles of dysfunction rather than as villains who had consciously chosen to harm me. It made forgiveness possible, though not required, and helped me recognize patterns I needed to actively avoid in my own future relationships. The professional success I achieved in Brussels exceeded anything I'd imagined possible during those cold nights in the garage. Within a year, I'd been promoted to senior consultant and was leading projects that influenced energy policy across multiple continents. My income had increased tenfold from my government salary, allowing me to achieve a level of financial security I'd never thought possible. But more importantly, I'd built a professional reputation based on my actual capabilities rather than stolen credentials or family manipulation. Colleagues sought my input because they respected my expertise and judgment, not because they felt obligated to include me or because someone was paying them to pretend I had value. I started receiving speaking invitations from universities and conferences, opportunities to share my knowledge and experience with audiences who genuinely wanted to learn from me. The first time I stood in front of hundreds of energy professionals and saw them taking notes during my presentation, I felt a sense of validation that no amount of family approval could have provided. Dmitri remained a close friend and occasional collaborator, though our relationship had evolved beyond the mentor-mentee dynamic that characterized our early interactions. We worked together on several projects that combined his business networks with my technical expertise, creating partnerships that benefited both of us financially while advancing our shared interests in renewable energy development. He occasionally asked about my family, curious about whether I'd reconciled with my parents or maintained contact with Kevin. I explained that I'd chosen to prioritize relationships based on mutual respect and genuine care rather than biological obligation, and that I was at peace with having limited contact with people who had proven themselves unworthy of deeper trust. 2 years after moving to Brussels, I met someone who would become my partner in both personal and professional contexts. Claudia Bergmann was a German engineer specializing in renewable energy systems, brilliant and passionate about developing sustainable infrastructure solutions for developing countries. We met at a conference in Copenhagen, bonding over shared frustrations with bureaucratic obstacles to innovation and common interests in addressing climate change through practical technological solutions. Our relationship developed slowly and carefully, both of us bringing histories of betrayal and disappointment that made us cautious about trusting others. But Claudia had also experienced family dysfunction and professional exploitation, though in different forms than my own experiences, and we found comfort in sharing our stories with someone who truly understood the complexities of recovering from systematic abuse. What made our relationship work was the foundation of mutual respect and genuine interest in each other's well-being. Claudia valued my expertise and celebrated my professional successes without feeling threatened or competitive. She encouraged me to take risks and pursue opportunities that challenged my capabilities while also respecting my need for boundaries and control over my own career decisions. We built a life together that honored both our professional ambitions and our personal needs for stability and connection. Neither of us wanted traditional family structures or obligations, preferring to create our own definitions of partnership and commitment that reflected our values rather than social expectations. 3 years after the Thanksgiving garage incident, I returned to the United States for a speaking engagement at a national energy conference in Washington, D.C. My parents asked to meet me while I was in the country, suggesting we could have dinner and discuss rebuilding our relationship more seriously. I agreed to meet them at a restaurant near the conference venue, curious about whether they'd made genuine progress in understanding how their behavior had enabled Jessica's crimes and contributed to my years of marginalization. What I found was a mixture of growth and persistent dysfunction that reminded me why I'd chosen to maintain careful boundaries. Mom had clearly done significant work to understand her role in family dynamics, acknowledging specific instances where she dismissed my achievements or prioritized Jessica's comfort over my dignity. She apologized without making excuses, recognizing that her behavior had been harmful regardless of her intentions or the family patterns she'd been unconsciously repeating. Dad was less successful at genuine self-reflection, still uncomfortable with emotional conversations, and prone to minimizing past conflicts as normal sibling rivalry or typical family dynamics. He wanted to move forward without fully addressing what had happened, suggesting that Jessica's crimes were her own responsibility and shouldn't affect our parent-child relationship. I explained to both of them that rebuilding trust required acknowledgement of harm, consistent demonstration of changed behavior over time, and acceptance that our relationship would never return to what it had been before. I couldn't pretend that years of marginalization hadn't happened simply because they now recognized my professional value and I wouldn't prioritize their comfort over my own well-being. The conversation was difficult, but ultimately productive. We established clear expectations for future contact, agreed on boundaries that protected my autonomy while allowing for limited connection, and acknowledged that healing would be a long process without guaranteed outcomes. It wasn't the emotional reconciliation that might be expected in a movie or novel, but it was honest and realistic, given the depth of dysfunction we were addressing. Kevin had made more substantial progress in understanding his role in family dynamics and actively working to change his patterns. He'd been in therapy for over a year, processing his own experiences of being manipulated by Jessica and recognizing how he'd participated in my marginalization through his willingness to accept convenient lies rather than uncomfortable truths. We met separately for coffee, and he shared that he'd been following my career through public presentations and published articles, feeling both proud of my achievements and ashamed of his failure to recognize my worth when it could have made a difference. He didn't ask for forgiveness or immediate reconciliation, just acknowledged the harm he'd caused and committed to doing better in future interactions. I appreciated his honesty and the work he'd clearly done to understand his own behavior, but I also made clear that trust needed to be earned through consistent actions over time rather than rebuilt through emotional conversations. Our relationship might never return to what I'd hoped for during my childhood, but we could potentially develop a connection based on mutual respect and genuine care if he continued demonstrating growth. The speaking engagement in Washington went better than I could have imagined. I presented research on integrating renewable energy systems into existing grid infrastructure, sharing insights from my international consulting work, and offering practical solutions to challenges that had stymied many energy planners. The audience response was enthusiastic, with several attendees approaching me afterward to discuss collaboration opportunities and consulting projects. But what meant most was seeing my former government colleagues in the audience, people who had known me during my years of struggling against invisible obstacles and professional sabotage. They congratulated me not just on my presentation, but on my resilience and courage in exposing Jessica's operation despite the personal and professional risks involved. Standing in that conference room, surrounded by people who respected my expertise and valued my contributions, I finally understood how far I'd come from that cold garage in Binghamton. The journey from victim to empowered professional hadn't been quick or easy, but it had been absolutely necessary for my survival and growth. The garage had been a physical manifestation of my family's perception of my worth, a cold, uncomfortable space outside the warmth and belonging I desperately wanted. But it had also been the location where I'd finally learned the truth about the systematic exploitation and abuse that had defined my family relationships for years. Jessica's attempt to demonstrate my worthlessness to Dmitri had instead revealed my true value to someone who understood international energy consulting. Her surveillance and theft had provided the evidence needed to expose her criminal operation and protect national security. Her manipulation of family relationships had shown me the importance of choosing connection based on mutual respect rather than obligation and shared history. I still think about that Thanksgiving weekend sometimes, not with bitterness, but with gratitude for the harsh lessons it taught me about worth, dignity, and the importance of surrounding yourself with people who recognize your value. The cold garage floor was uncomfortable, but it was also where I stopped accepting treatment that diminished my capabilities and started demanding the respect that my expertise and character deserved. The transformation from sleeping in a garage to consulting with energy ministers across Europe wasn't just about professional advancement or financial success, it was about learning to value myself independently of others' recognition, to set boundaries without guilt, and to build relationships based on genuine mutual respect rather than desperate need for acceptance. Sometimes the worst betrayals become catalysts for the most profound personal growth. Jessica spent years stealing my work and sabotaging my opportunities, but she ultimately provided me with the motivation and evidence I needed to build a career and life that far exceeded anything I could have achieved while seeking approval from people who were incapable of recognizing my worth. The garage was cold, uncomfortable, and humiliating, but it was also where I finally learned to stop being grateful for scraps and started claiming the recognition and opportunities that my expertise deserved. It was where I discovered that my worth wasn't determined by family dynamics or childhood roles, but by my own achievements and the respect of people who understood the value of what I could contribute. And now, standing in my comfortable Brussels apartment with Claudia, building a career that challenges and fulfills me, surrounded by colleagues and friends who genuinely value my presence, I understand that the best revenge against those who tried to diminish me was simply living well and achieving the success they tried to prevent. The energy minister that Dmitri had been looking for was never staying in a guest room or luxury hotel. He was sleeping on a deflated air mattress in a cold garage, unaware of his international reputation, but about to discover his true worth through circumstances that seemed designed to break him, but instead revealed his strength. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.